Hi and welcome back. This is the second BBX podcast. BBX stands, of course, for Bold Books and Bones. And if you watch or listen to this podcast on YouTube, you will see that this channel is all about the passion for books. In this second edition of the BBX podcast, I have again a very special guest. He is a monk, and we could say that he is an important guardian of knowledge. He belongs to a tradition that exists now for 15 centuries. And I'm impressed by the kind of work that he does. The name of the monk is Father Columba. He is a soft-spoken and humble man with a wonderful dry sense of humor, and he is a member of the Christian Order of Saint Benedict. And he also loves fly fishing. But that is completely irrelevant for our story of today. Now, through his work, he and his team were able to safeguard more than 50 million handwritten pages. And these pages belong to books and manuscripts from the ancient times all the way to the early modern eras. When we think about it, then 50 million pages represent 50 million times throughout history that a man or a woman sat over a page and copied the text or saw his or her chance to share their thoughts with the future. So these are not just pages, but human voices that are preserved. Father Columba was so kind to accept the invitation to Bold Books and Bones. And in this podcast, you will learn more about him, about the important work that he does, about how the fear for nuclear war was a driver to protect our ancient knowledge, and we will also learn about the HMML, that is written HMML, which is the institute that he leads. And finally, you will discover why his work is so relevant for our humankind. Now, unfortunately, the sound recording in the first few minutes is not perfect. I apologize for that, but I promise you that it gets better after a couple of minutes. So, let's meet Father Columba. Hi, Father Columba.
Hello, Levin.
Thank you very much for being a guest at the Bold Books and Bones YouTube channel. It's really a pleasure to have you here. If I look at your work, I think the least to say is that it's quite extraordinary work that you do. You travel all over the world and you protect old books and manuscripts by making digital copies of it. Can you maybe elaborate a bit on the purpose of your work and on the function of the institute that you lead?
So HMML, the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, has been around since 1965. And it was started by the Benedictine monks of St. John's Abbey here in Minnesota as a way to preserve Benedictine culture in Cold War Europe. And the fear, of course, was that there would be nuclear war, and that in that case, there would be destruction of libraries, as happened in places like, famous libraries in Europe during the wars. So we started microfilming in Austria in 1965 for that reason. And then over time, the mission grew. So we worked with non-Benedictine Christian libraries and then with university libraries with manuscripts from many traditions. Went to Ethiopia in the 1970s. And since 2003, when I became director, largely focused on conflict zones and places outside of Europe and even non-Christian communities.
So you digitize books and you make them and old manuscripts and you make them available for everyone online. But there are also other online libraries of manuscripts and old books. I think about the Morgan Library, the British Library. But I understood that your collection is quite unique. Could you maybe elaborate a bit on that and why does that matter actually?
So there are really two aspects to the work that we do, two parts to our mission.
Okay.
One of them is digital preservation. So we used to use microfilm, now we use digital images to make sure there's a copy, just in case. And there are so many things that can happen to a manuscript. And manuscripts are different from printed books, remember, because every manuscript is unique. It's not just another example, something that comes off the printing press. So preservation is number one, and then access for scholars is number two, and we're committed to both of those. Now, what's different from what we do and what we have in our photographic archive from the great libraries you mentioned, and so many like them in Western countries, is we don't take the manuscripts. They stay in their original location. And many of them are from places where they have not been studied very much. So in a way, the manuscripts in the great European and North American libraries are one part of the story. And then all of the things that we've microfilmed or digitized are the other part of the story. So it gives the full picture and also includes manuscripts that were not of interest to European and North American collectors or colonial agents who went shopping and built the great libraries that we all treasure, like the British Library, the Bodleian, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Staatsbibliothek. So we, in a way, are kind of a complement to them, except we also do it in a kind of modern, more sensitive way, in that we leave the manuscripts in their original location.
So you leave them in the original place, and you protect these books. And I think there are quite some spectacular examples of the value of your library. I heard about the destruction of the library in Iraq, where after the war you still had the copy available for them. Can you maybe tell a bit the story of what happened exactly?
Of course. I became executive director in 2003. So that, of course, is the year of the invasion of Iraq and the beginning of the terrible dislocation and conflict in that country. We started working in Iraq in 2009, and we found an Iraqi Dominican friar who had already started a project. We worked with him on new projects and built up the technology and the team for his work. At that time, we all thought Iraq was settling down. And in fact, my first journey to Iraq in February of 2009, I remember sitting in a room full of people in Karakosh, Iraq, a Christian village. And President Obama was on television announcing that the American troops would leave Iraq. So it's over. We kept working for many years. And then 2014, people remember, was the year that the Islamic State or ISIS or Daesh suddenly emerged, conquered Mosul, moved across the plain of Nineveh, expelling Christian and Yazidi villagers, imprisoning and enslaving many of them. Nobody saw that coming. So as a result, some of the libraries that we, with our Iraqi partners, of course, digitized, they're the heroes of the story. They're the ones who actually are doing the work. We provide the support. Some of those libraries were destroyed because they did not have time to rescue them. Others were moved, but have become inaccessible because they're now being kept in secret locations for safety because they learned a lesson. The situation remains unstable. So this means that in some cases, the digital images are the only way people can read the manuscripts because the originals are either destroyed, as in the case of some libraries, or they're simply impossible to access them.
Yeah. And with your library, you put them online, accessible to everyone, to scholars, but maybe also people who want to continue their cultural tradition, who need access to these old documents then.
Absolutely. Many of the people who use our collections from places like the Middle East or South Asia and so on, many of the people who use those collections are members of these communities who know the languages, have an interest in their own culture. They may not be professional academics, but they are clergy who are interested in liturgy, or people who are interested in traditional poetry or hymns or prayers of some kind. Mm. And this is all there for them to use, as well as for the kind of professional academic scholars.
Yeah, yeah, and also we talk now about Iraq and for us faraway countries, but actually your work is also very relevant for our own cultures. I grew up in Cologne, and I remember 2009 when our archive collapsed because of an accident. Many documents were destroyed. but I learned from you that you kept a copy of the medieval manuscripts that were stored in the archives.
That's right. In our early years, in the 1960s, 1970s, 80s, we did a lot of microfilming in Austria and Germany, and then Switzerland. And so we did microfilm the medieval manuscripts of that archive in Cologne, as we did in so many other places. And they suffered that terrible destruction and loss of their library. Will take many years, even decades, to recover everything. But meanwhile, there is at least the microfilm as they do the slow work of restoring and conserving the manuscripts they could recover.
Yeah. And so it's really not only a topic from far away, because archives and libraries are also destroyed in our countries. I think earlier you also told me about the historical library in Weimar that burned down in 2004. So it's not just historical conservation from faraway countries, but it's for humanity as a whole to
Exactly.
safeguard their heritage, if I understand it right.
So I think there's accidents. So obviously Cologne and Weimar, those were accidents. But there are also cases where situations change very rapidly. And you could have, arsonist, or you could have some kind of demonstration that becomes violent. That could happen anywhere, as we see now in our world today. And then in places like Iraq and Syria, where we worked for many years thinking things were getting better, or they were very stable, we saw how suddenly the situation can change.
Mm. Now you have thousands of manuscripts in your library and old books, and they have a wide range from astronomy, medicine, poetry, history, philosophical texts. Is there one that is especially remarkable for you in this collection? I'm sure there will be many, but could you maybe give us one example of a remarkable manuscript that the library owns?
Well, remember, we don't own it. So these manuscripts in our collection are owned by somebody else.
Okay.
Although we do have some manuscripts of our own, just a few, that have been given to us over the years. By far the greatest part of what we have are these images that we have in trust from the owners. So we've talked a little bit about Iraq and Syria, and I can give an example from Syria, which is very close to my heart. There was a manuscript in Aleppo, that cosmopolitan Syrian city that was on the Silk Road, always a place where different religions and cultures coexisted. And we did a lot of work in Aleppo between 2005 and 2012. There's a particular manuscript in Aleppo that was the only copy surviving in the original Syriac language of a history of the world written in the 12th century by a Syriac Orthodox patriarch whose name was Michael the Great. And what's interesting about this text is that although much of the earlier history was simply copied from other writers, he writes about his own times. So he's an eyewitness. And one of the things he talks about is what happened to Christians in the Middle East when the Crusaders arrived, the European Christians, to liberate the holy places for the sake of Christianity, not realizing that there were local Christians, many of whom actually were attacked by Crusaders because they assumed they were Muslims, and also who were punished by their Muslim rulers for the intervention of their foreign co-religionists. So this is exactly what happened in Iraq in 2003. So it's an example of something that just keeps happening. The foreign intervention, unintended consequences, and this Syriac Orthodox figure talks about the punishments that were inflicted on the local Christians because the foreign Christians had arrived. This manuscript itself has an interesting backstory. It was originally kept in Edessa in southeast Turkey. It's the modern Turkish city of Şanlıurfa, or Urfa. This was the very cradle of Syriac Christianity from the 4th century on. And by the early 20th century, had a small Christian community still there who had to leave in the 1920s as part of the general persecution of Christians as the Ottoman Empire sort of fell to pieces. So the whole community left Edessa, Urfa, and went to Aleppo. as refugees, starting over. And all they brought with them were their manuscripts and the key to their church in Edessa. This single copy of the manuscript was kept in a vault in a church in Aleppo for safety. It was very rarely ever seen. There had been a 19th century scholar who had a look at it and tried to make a copy of it, but it was not perfect. We developed a friendship with the bishop in Aleppo, and through many, many cups of coffee and conversation and working on other manuscripts in his library, he gave us permission to digitize it. So it's been digitized, it's online. There's even a printed copy of the photographs done by the Syriac Orthodox publisher. But the poignancy of the story, the manuscript taken by refugees from Turkey to Syria. The bishop who allowed us to digitize it during the Syrian civil war, which broke out after we had done the digitizing work, was kidnapped in 2013, never heard from again. So the cycles of violence that keep happening to these communities, particularly minority communities, whatever kind, whatever it is that makes them a minority. So the history that you read about in these old manuscripts, this is a story that keeps happening again and again. So that's why listening to these voices of the past and the experience of the elders is of crucial importance to us, in the hope that perhaps someday we'll make better decisions.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's how the study of history is supposed to be, that we learn from the patterns that were already took place in the past.
Supposed to be.
Supposed to be. Yeah. All right. So Father Columba, the Benedict Order was founded, I think, in the 6th century. And there has always been a tradition of reading and copying books and preserving books for next generations. But now we are 15 centuries later, and the order still exists. You still do your work, but you're now also on YouTube, on Instagram. You have this World Wide Web library available. I understand that your order was always been open to new technology. Can you maybe tell us a bit more about that one?
Absolutely. We've always been very practical in our approach to tools, technology, ways to do our work better. And if you think of our basic commitment as Benedictines to prayer and work, so we pray the Psalms together several times a day in our church, we celebrate the Mass, we have our manual labor, we have people who are artistic, people who are teachers. All of this requires tools. And if you can have a better tool, you use it. So, for example, in the Middle Ages, Benedictines used clocks. And I won't say we invented clocks, but we were early in the West in using clocks, which were water clocks. And the purpose of this was to wake the monks up in the middle of the night for their prayers, because otherwise you have to rely on somebody remaining awake and not falling asleep, and then waking everybody else up. Another example is the printing press, because people often think, because of the caricature of the medieval monk copying the manuscript, that we resented printing because it would put us out of business or diminish this traditional occupation. We love printing. We did it right from the start because suddenly you could have 500 copies. So you could distribute the texts in your church to the other monasteries, to those interested in them. And the same is true of digital technology. So we've very early on using the internet, just as we were using microfilm in the 1960s to photograph manuscripts that seemed modern at that time. And so the move to digital imaging for us in 2003, once we were confident that it was a stable technology and a high quality technology, was the natural move for us.
In the 15 centuries that you exist, your order was often an early adopter of new technology then, actually.
Absolutely early adopters. The sort of notion that all human learning has value, because for us, all human learning is what we've been made capable of doing by God. And so we don't reject human learning or invention unless it's evil. And a printing press, digital technology, anything can be used for evil, but almost everything can also be used for good.
Yeah.
So this has always been our approach.
Okay. All right. And also I learned that the people always talk about the Gutenberg Bible, but the second book that was printed on that press was a Benedictine document, right?
That's correct. So Gutenberg printed his Bible, and of course that was a Catholic Latin Bible, magnificent. We've all, perhaps, if we've been fortunate, seen copies of it in great libraries or seen photographs. Enormously ambitious undertaking that bankrupted Gutenberg. So he basically had to give up his printing press to the people to whom he owed money. And one of his apprentices was smart enough to marry the daughter of the banker or the daughter of the creditor. And so this printer, Peter Schuffer, took over the equipment and also printed books in Mainz. And so the next book that was printed on that equipment, complete book, was a book of Psalms, Latin book of Psalms, for the Benedictines of Mainz and elsewhere to use in their prayers. And we're fortunate here to actually have a page of that Psalter,
Oh, nice.
1459.
And are there still the complete Psalters? Does it still exist, or?
There are a few complete copies in great libraries, extremely valuable, obviously, like the Gutenberg Bible, because they're so early.
Yes.
From the 1450s.
Very nice.
Very beautiful, very beautiful.
Now, your library, the large library that you created, is in the cloud, as they say. And if I looked at some numbers from your website, and I read that only for the Malta manuscripts, only for one country, there is like 16,000 reels of microfilm and 2.5 million images. That's an enormous amount of memory that and space that is used. But I'm wondering, like, is it now is storing this information in this way, in this digital way, now more safe than before? What is the philosophy behind that from your institute?
It's a really interesting question, because the most durable form of a manuscript is the manuscript, the physical object. But those are also vulnerable, as we know from fire and war and everything else. The challenge with digital imaging, as people know from their holidays and their family photographs, is you have to have a way of backing it up. And you have to have a way of using media or formats that will not become obsolete. So the old 5 1/4-inch floppy disk that I wrote my doctoral dissertation on, replaced by the 3.5-inch diskette, replaced by, et cetera, et cetera. So one of our commitments here is to make sure that we have multiple copies, multiple media, multiple locations, so that all the digital images and even the microfilms exist in more than one copy. So there's the principle of lots of copies keep stuff safe, the LOCKSS principle. And that's something that any digital librarian or archivist is familiar with. So we practice that here.
Mm-hmm. And is it true that you even have a ultimate copy also stored for very extreme circumstances?
We have our ultimate post-apocalyptic Mad Max backup copy stored on digital tape inside a mountain in Utah. And this is the kind of remote, highly secure copy. It's still digital media. So there is still the technological issue of you have to have something that can read it and decode it. So we have not printed everything out. We don't have the resources to do that. We don't have a technology yet for that. But the hope is that even should there be technological catastrophe of some kind, let's say the internet goes down, or we have an electromagnetic pulse, or there's a war or something, that the digital data itself could still be read. And I take comfort in the fact that at the end of the day, digital data is simply ones and zeros. It's strings of ones and zeros. And it just takes a clever Benedictine to figure out the code to read all of that.
Perfect. So future is secured. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. Another question that I have is something close to my heart, because I'm fascinated by the fact that many of the books and manuscripts that are in the library haven't been studied yet, and often are written in languages that, unfortunately, that the communities who spoke those languages don't even exist anymore. What is your hope here for this information of all? What is your hope for all this knowledge towards the future? Is there a risk that they just sit there and nobody uses it? What's the philosophy behind it here?
There's always the possibility that a manuscript will never be read. But our hope is that if we keep it safe and accessible long enough, somebody will. And one of our fundamental philosophies since the beginning of our project has been, wherever possible, photograph every manuscript in a library and not decide now what's interesting. Because somebody 50, 100 years from now may find that particular manuscript extremely interesting that we had dismissed as boring for whatever reason. And so this is how libraries operate. They don't throw out every book that hasn't been read in the past year. Instead, they're guardians of the manuscripts and books on their shelves, so that they wait for the right moment when the book is ready for someone to learn what's inside it. And this is our principle as well.
Yeah, and that could be in 2 years, it can be next week, it can be in 200 years, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think you had also an example of today that somebody finds something that was never been checked out yet, or?
So all libraries have a basement or a back room where they have things that have not yet been cataloged. So ask any librarian. This is the dirty secret of librarians. They can't do everything, right? So in our basement, in our rare book room, we have some Arabic and Turkish manuscripts that were collected by a monk at some point. Who knows? He brought them home. Nobody really looked at them. Only recently have we had specialists on our staff who can read these and understand what's in them. And so announced today on our internal communications channel and coming soon to social media is the fact that one of our catalogers who was looking at one of our actual physical rare books in our collection is a completely unknown copy of legal opinions in Arabic and Turkish by a scholar named Qasim al-Bandari. Now, he was a Turk or an Arabic-speaking person, I don't know enough about his background, who lived in Ottoman-ruled Crete in the late 18th century. So Crete, we think of today as Greek, it's Greek Orthodox, all of this. It was part of the Ottoman Empire. And so legal opinions were issued in accordance with Islamic law. So this man wrote down legal opinions, fatwas, in Arabic and in Turkish. And our cataloger thinks it may be the only existing copy of this text.
No.
Now, legal history, you may think that's really boring, but the point of looking at this kind of material, legal opinions, archives, is it shows us daily life. So what was the daily life in late 18th century Crete under Ottoman rule? What were the issues that people brought? And more historians and scholars are interested in precisely those things, not just famous texts or fancy literature, but what was the actual daily life of these people like? And so a text like this one can open that up.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, Father Columba, I think it's fair to say that in the colonial time and also afterwards, a lot of artifacts were stolen from cultures all over the world, and including manuscripts, and they were sold to private collections or to Western libraries. And then suddenly you come along and you go to these communities, and they trust you. They trust you with literally the voices of their ancestors. Why are they trusting you? What is unique in the approach of the Himmel when you go to these different countries and communities that are often afraid of losing their history? What is your approach there?
Well, first of all, we don't come to take it. So many of these communities see a European or an American, and they assume they've come to take something away. And again, that's how we have these magnificent libraries around the world, which are created from things taken from somewhere else. So the fact that we present ourselves as partners, that we are there in a position of respect for their culture, even if it's a culture that I don't share because of language or religion. And I think also the fact that we have a Benedictine connection or a Catholic connection says we're not there for money. We're not for profit. We really are there in the interest of preserving human culture. And it takes a while to build relationships. We sit, we talk, we get to know each other. They try to get a feel for our true motives, if there's something hidden. And these are often very sophisticated, very perceptive people who have had to survive and had to take care of their cultural heritage. So they know all the angles. And if we pass that test, they're happy to work with us. And the result of this, of course, is not only these wonderful collections, but also a whole series of relationships, which have become very personally meaningful to me. And I think also to members of our board and our friends who have the chance to meet some of these people. Tremendously enriching on every level.
So you not only copy the manuscripts, but you build also really bridges between cultures and between people, actually.
Very much so.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a bit of more personal question when I look at your work and what you do for humanity. There is a clear image of a man who is very tolerant and open-minded. You do not only preserve important books and manuscripts from a Christian tradition, but you do that also for Muslim tradition, for the Jewish tradition. And some of the videos, I hear you speak with a lot of respect for the pre-Christian philosophers and for other world religions. So I see this very tolerant person, but I'm wondering, the current times, we see a lot of intolerance. We see that people are afraid of what's different from theirs. How did you become so tolerant? What and how do you nurture that? What is your approach there?
I think part of it is background. My family was always very tolerant, very deeply rooted in Catholic culture, but Catholic culture in the broad sense. So Catholic in the true sense of universal. And recognizing that all people are in the image and likeness of God, all human knowledge, ingenuity, and experience has validity and importance. I had a very good humanities education, for which I'm extremely grateful. I learned how to read, I learned how to write, I learned how to think. And joining the Benedictine Order was kind of a natural step for me because that's been our tradition. The first Latin translation of the Quran was commissioned by a Benedictine. And so rather than simply fighting Muslims in an era of religious conflict, the Benedictines knew they should read the text first. So if you're going to have a good argument with somebody or try to persuade them of your point of view, you need to do some research. And so I think that thread of openness and hospitality runs through Benedictine culture. So, for example, my own monastery in the 1940s and 50s, we were pioneers of ecumenical conversation with Protestants. Now, it seems strange that this would be controversial now, but in those days, it was a big deal that Catholics and Lutherans in a place like Minnesota would actually talk to each other and try to figure out what they had in common and then identify more clearly what their differences were for the sake of understanding. So this has been our stance. Our move into the Islamic world, which started in 2011 and really fortified in 2013 in Jerusalem, was all in the interest of studying culture in the broadest way. Example, the old city of Jerusalem, we worked with Christians. A Muslim family, a very historic family with a great library, asked us to digitize their manuscripts. We thought about it. And as I said to our board, as we thought about what we should do with this request, I said, look, the people have lived next to each other for centuries. The libraries are within 100, 200 meters of each other. They've interacted constantly. They've had arguments. There have probably been people who've converted from one side to the other over the years. Why would we not want all of the manuscripts to be together in one place for the sake of that same conversation? So this has really fueled some of our largest projects in places like Mali and West Africa, South Asia, working with Persian and Urdu manuscripts, some tentative moves into working with Buddhist and Hindu manuscripts in Nepal. It's all part of the same body of human wisdom. And so for us, it's natural to follow it all.
Very, very nice. Thank you very, very much, Father Columba, for your time. It's truly an honor to talk to you. I really enjoyed this conversation a lot. And by looking at your new website, which is really well made, I learned a lot of new things already. You have also events in Minnesota, in St. John's. You have lectures. There's of course the museum itself. So I think it's definitely on my bucket list to visit Minnesota and your wonderful institution once the virus is a bit under control. That's on top of my bucket list.
You're always welcome. Benedictines do practice hospitality, so we look forward to the day when we can welcome you here.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very, very much for the nice talk.
You're most welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Bye.
Have a nice day.